If the user leaves the fields as empty and presses the floating action button, a blank bookmark would be saved. Ideally, we should notify the user that neither of the two fields can be left empty for saving a bookmark. And that's what we would be doing by showing a snack bar to the user if either of the two fields are empty when they press the floating action button. A snack bar is a widget from the Android universe, which is a pop-up message briefly sticking to the bottom of the screen. Before implementing a snack bar, let's first implement the condition which, when true, would trigger displaying the snack bar. So inside the function passed to the onPressed parameter, we would check if the input is valid. If it isn't, the flow would transfer to the else condition where we would display our snack bar. And since we need to be able to access the inputs to check if they are empty or not, we can pass the title and link to the isInputValid method. The same applies to the error function too, so that we can show a suitable message to the user on the basis of which of the two fields is empty. We can now let these two methods know what title and link actually are by initializing these two variables using the value of the inputs from the corresponding text controllers. Now, we can easily make use of the shortcut menu to generate these two methods. Notice how Dart automatically understands that since this method is placed inside an if condition, the return type for this would be a bool value. In our isInputValid method, we would return true if both our inputs are not empty values. IsNotEmpty method is a getter method defined in the string class. A getter method is a basic method that simply returns a value without performing any operations on it. The get keyword between the return type bool and the method name isNotEmpty denotes that this is a getter method. Next, we generate the showInputError method using the shortcut menu. Here, on the basis of which of the two inputs is empty, we print the corresponding error message for now. On hot reloading, we see that pressing the floating action button with both the inputs empty prints title is empty, since the flow transfers to the else condition, after which the showInputError method checks the if condition for title is empty, and since it is true, it prints this statement. If we add text to the title field and leave the link field blank, pressing the floating action button prints link is empty. When neither of the two fields are empty, our if condition on line 27 holds true, and hence both the title and link are printed. Next, we'll replace our two error print statements with the action of displaying a snack bar. For this, let's create a new method called showSnackBar. A snack bar can be accessed using the context of the scaffold, wrapping it, and then by using the showSnackBar method, which takes in an argument of type snackbar. Flutter handles the implementation of the snack bar on its own, but it needs the mandatory content argument, which would be the content displayed inside the snack bar when it is shown. The parameter content is of the type widget, so we pass in a simple text widget to it with the text message. This message would be passed to our showSnackBar method as an argument of the type string. Now, all we need to do is replace our print statements with calls to our showSnackBar method. Let's clear the console and press the floating action button. We observe that the flow for both inputs being valid still works well since we made changes only inside the else condition. As soon as we clear the link and press the floating action button, we still get a print statement instead of a snack bar. This happens because after making our changes, we forgot to hot reload. Once we do that and try pressing the floating action button again, we see a runtime error printed in the logs. Even though the logs may seem overwhelming, they provide useful information for us to fix the error. On scrolling to the top of the logs, we are informed that there seems to be an issue with the context that we are using to access the showSnackBar method from the scaffold class. Specifically, the context being used here is the context from the argument of the build method. But for our use case, this context must come from within the scaffold and not outside it. To understand how exactly we arrived at this conclusion, let's dive into the definition of the static method of from the scaffold class. The docs for this of method explain our issue, and this is what the error logs were talking about as well. Moreover, right after the explanation of the issue, we see a couple of solutions to this issue being proposed as well. One of these solutions involves using a builder that would provide a new scope to the context under the scaffold wrapping our snack bar. The example code suggests adding a builder so that it creates an inner build context that can be used to refer to the scaffold with scaffold.off. Since we need access to the inner context from inside the floating action button, we wrap it with a builder widget. The builder widget has one required parameter called builder. All this parameter does is consume the context and return a widget using a function. Since there is just a single return statement inside this function, we can convert it to an expression using the fat arrow operator if needed. Notice that the context being used in the showSnackBar method is still the context from the argument of the build method. To make this showSnackBar method use the inner context from the builder, we need to pass down this context to the showSnackBar method. Observe that as soon as this is done, the color of the context also changes from purple, which is used to represent a global variable, to white, which is used to represent a local variable. We have one tiny error in our code because of a missing semicolon after the return statement. Once fixed, hot reload your code. First, we test the happy flow to see if we didn't break anything with that. Since that looks good, let's remove the first input and test the snack bar. As expected, a snack bar pops up from the bottom of the screen with the message that was passed to it in the case of the title input being empty. This also works well for the case when the link is empty instead. But we notice that even after quickly entering an input for the link field, the snack bar from the previous error hasn't gone away. Let's address this issue. On diving into the implementation of the snack bar, we observe that the default duration of the snack bar being displayed is 4 seconds. And that's why, even after having both inputs as non-empty, it may mislead the user into thinking that they still have an error. One way to fix this is to override the duration of the snack bar and provide a smaller value than 4000 milliseconds. But a better way would be to simply hide the current snack bar being displayed whenever the floating action button is pressed. So inside our onPressed function, we use the scaffold to get access to the hide snack bar method. Now after hot reloading, as soon as we press the floating action button, the current snack bar is dismissed. Our validations now work as planned. Another way to use validations on text form fields is to use the validator parameter from the text form field itself. A link for that has been added in the lesson notes.